Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today we're looking at a video on breaking in the habit that asks, is there proof that God exists? And then immediately answers that question with a yes. So I'm sure this will be something more concrete than philosophizing that has basically stayed the same for the last several hundred years, right? Right? Okay, I think we all know the answer to that question, but let's take a look anyway and see what he's got for us. But first, a word from today's sponsor, me! Do you know how to edit videos and need a bit of extra cash? Are you concerned about my mental health as I slowly spiral myself away from sanity? Do you want my kids to have a father again?
Father, come play with us!
Well then have I got a proposition for you. Head over to vicerhino.com/apply and fill out the form for your chance to be my editor.
It's actually going to be at apply.vicerhino.com because Hover is like the worst domain name service ever, and forwards that use a slash don't work even though it lets you set them up. So apply.vicerhino.com.
If chosen, you not only get to edit my regular Friday videos, you'll also get to chop my Wednesday live streams into segments for my other channel, The Watering Hole. Do you not want to work for me, but want to help pay an editor for their work so I don't have to resort to locking them in my basement and withholding food and water until their work is done? Then head on over to patreon.com/vicerhino and pledge as little as $1 per week or join as a channel member here on YouTube. Patrons get videos a day early, channel members get it whenever it happens to be finished because YouTube only just figured out how to have a video go from members only to live like a couple months ago, but they have yet to figure out how to schedule something to go live to members at a regular time and then go live to everyone else later. Don't worry, I'm sure they'll figure it out eventually. Also, for logistical reasons, only patrons get the shout out at the end of the video, not channel members, but members also get Rhino emojis that they can use in the comment section. So there are differences, but it's not much that you get except for, like, me, to be honest, so... Anywho, on to Father Casey.
Around the world, literally billions of people believe in some form of a God, an all-knowing, all-powerful creator of everything in existence, absolutely confounding atheists.
Is it really confounding to atheists? People like easy answers to difficult questions, and God is exactly that. It's not confounding, it's actually an easy answer to that question.
You believe in something that you can't see, hear, or touch, of which there is no physical evidence of in the entire universe?
I mean, I guess thanks for the admission that there's no physical evidence for God. Kind of weird admission from a Catholic who presumably accepts the canonization process for saints, where those saints have to have performed miracles, and the evidence for those miracles is, in theory, examined and scrutinized and presumably would include physical evidence when the miracle being claimed as something like a healing. But hey, I'll take it.
Yeah, only for Catholics, this does not mean that God is the result of some wishful thinking or illogical fallacies.
No, belief in God is not logically fallacious per se, though every argument for God that I've come across thus far does indeed make use of at least one fallacy to get from its premises to its conclusion. And while I wouldn't say that wishful thinking doesn't play any role, I can agree that it's not a universal factor in belief in God. Though with people like Low Bar Bill Craig explicitly stating that they lowered the epistemic bar that Christianity must meet to be believed, specifically because they wanted it to be true.
I thought to myself, and I'm not kidding, I thought, if there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing. And so my attitude toward this is just the opposite of Kyle's. Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it.
The idea that it's not ubiquitous is getting harder to defend. So apologists aren't really doing themselves any favor when they say things like that.
We believe that there is not only evidence for God's existence found in the accounts of sacred scripture, personal prayer, and private revelations, but actual proofs, philosophical arguments that logically point to the existence of a God.
So, a book that is obviously severely flawed, personal experiences that cannot be verified or demonstrated to non-believers, and the aforementioned logical arguments that all make use of various fallacies. Now, to be clear, being fallacious does not automatically render the conclusion of an argument false when the argument uses one of the informal fallacies, but it does invalidate that particular argument.
In the absence of verifiable scientific evidence for God, theologians and philosophers have turned to logical arguments to prove God's existence for centuries.
An exercise that you wouldn't think would be necessary when it comes to proving the existence of an all-powerful being that, according to the Bible, wants everyone to believe in him. Now, sure, there might be a reason for his hiddenness that we're just not capable of understanding, but if you're going to hide behind mysterious ways, you can't also claim that you're using unbiased logic to get to a belief in God in the first place. Mysterious ways is a defense specifically against the fact that if the God described by Christians exists, he behaves in a way that we see as illogical or irrational when compared to his stated goals. So yes, it is possible that he has reasons that are just beyond us that actually would sort out these discrepancies, but since they are in fact beyond us, we can't claim to use logic that we understand in order to get to that conclusion. It's almost explicitly a God of the gaps fallacy, where we see something clearly illogical, but assume without justification that God's greater understanding makes the logic work somehow.
Sometimes you don't have to see something to know it exists.
So, Father Casey here is probably not using the word see to mean specifically detect visually, but given how many Christians will ridicule atheists for refusing to believe in things that they can't see, because obviously air is a thing that exists and you can't see air, it would behoove him to not phrase it that way in order to avoid promoting misconceptions that make it obvious that Christians who repeat them don't actually understand the atheist position. If I were a more cynical person, I might suggest that such phrasing is used on purpose to encourage those misconceptions in order to keep Christians believing that the position of atheism is intellectually bankrupt, and so even if they begin doubting at some point, they at least won't be willing to adopt a label that they associate with such idiocy.
While the arguments are many and varied, and not all of them are particularly helpful, each of these arguments can be grouped into one of four categories of approaches.
My question is, if you find some of them to not be particularly helpful, why do you keep using and promoting them? Why not drop the unhelpful ones? Is it because there's actually so little on your side that you have to cling on to everything you can in order to make it seem like you have more than you do? That is it, isn't it? Because if that wasn't it, then you would just drop them, because they're not helpful.
Cosmological, ontological, moral, and theological.
Cosmological. Stuff exists, therefore God. Ontological. I like the idea of God, therefore God. Moral. There are some general moral principles that see wide agreement among different cultures, therefore God. And teleological. Life exists where it is possible for life to exist, therefore God. Obviously, these statements are reductionist in order to highlight what are the primary logical fallacies in each category, and some of the arguments work in ways that wouldn't be covered by my reductionist language, but that is the essence of these categories.
The first type, the cosmological argument, is probably the most famous and the strongest of the arguments.
Oh boy, that's the strongest? I'm sorry that your arguments are all so bad that such a bad argument ends up on top.
Looking into the universe, or cosmos, we notice a relationship between all in the created order. There are patterns that develop, motion is visible, and contingencies that arise.
My God, are you incapable of just saying it in normal terms? Like, all you essentially said there is that stuff exists and acts in accordance with the laws of physics. Not everything has to be gussied up to sound philosophical and aloof.
What this argument proposes is that if there is anything that is now that wasn't before, there must be something that caused it.
And since we know that causality on quantum scales doesn't necessarily work that way, and we know that the origin of the universe happened on quantum scales, then the origin of the universe didn't necessarily work that way. Ergo, the main premise of the argument, while it seems intuitively true, fails to match up with reality.
For an example, we can look to St. Thomas Aquinas' second proof, referred to as the proof of first cause or efficient cause. We know that if something, A, exists, it did not create itself, but was created by something else, B. If B doesn't exist, then A cannot exist either. But this also applies to B, meaning that there must be a cause C for B and a cause D for C, and so on. To repeat this process infinitely would not make any sense, for there must be a first cause. And the only way for this to be true is if there is a being that is causality itself, existing outside of time and space in pure actuality. In other words, God.
No, that's not true. First off, see my earlier thing about how that's not how causality works on the quantum level, meaning that it is entirely possible for the universe to have caused itself, but that aside, there are a number of solutions to the problem of an infinite regress of causes. First, Yes, you can plunk God down as the first cause, and then use some special pleading to avoid the necessity of God also having a cause, given the logic that got us to a God in the first place. But there's also the fact that if time began at the same time as the universe, then there's no need for temporal causality. As the Hartle-Hawking model suggests, at an early enough time in the universe, time gives way to space, leaving us with space but no time, not an infinite regress. The Carroll-Chen model has the arrow of time reversing at the Big Bang, providing a temporal beginning, while simultaneously having a universe that extends infinitely in both temporal directions. And then there are a bunch more that, as little of an understanding as I have of those two models, I understand even less. Now, are any of our current cosmological models the correct one? The one that actually perfectly describes how the universe began? Almost certainly not. But what they have done is shown that there are several ways, given what we know about how the laws of physics operate, by which a universe could plausibly have started without the intervention of a god. You are welcome to plug your god in as the ultimate cause that got everything started, as some scientists do, but he's not a necessary cause, and an application of Occam's razor would have us do away with him.
You might think of it in more practical terms. Why do you exist? Well, because your parents made you. Why do they exist? Because their parents made them. And so on, and so on. But when would this stop? Before every being, there is something that caused it to come into being, including the Big Bang itself.
And this is a composition fallacy. A composition fallacy arises when you assume that something that is true of a part of something must be true of the whole because it is true of that part. In this case, things within the universe have temporal causes, therefore the universe as a whole must also have a temporal cause. But this is not necessarily true.
Everything in existence may have existed in a super dense mass before exploding into everything that is, but what caused that mass to explode, and how did that matter come to exist in the first place?
Well, instead of asking centuries-dead Christian philosophers who were copying the work of millennia-dead Greek philosophers, we could ask modern cosmologists. And when we do, we find that an application of the laws of physics, as we currently understand them, is all that is needed to get the universe going.
Why is there something rather than nothing?
Stuff exists, therefore God. Thank you for affirming that my reductionist version of the argument was accurate.
There must be a first cause, and the only explanation for this would be a being that has always existed and was never caused by anything else. We call that being God.
But since everything must have a cause, according to the argument, the existence of such a being is impossible. Unless you update yourself to at least the Kalam version of the argument, where we get to everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. Which is still on shaky and fallacious grounds despite avoiding the special pleading of the other versions of the cosmological argument, but has the additional downfall of not even getting us to a god as the cause.
St. Thomas uses this line of thinking for three of his other arguments, namely for motion, contingency, and gradation, all pointing to the illogical nature of an infinite regress, to prove that there must be an ultimate mover, cause, necessity, or standard by which everything else exists.
And why such a thing should be anything other than the laws of physics, I do not know.
But what if we don't want to look to the world, we want to think about God in God's self? For that, we can look to St. Anselm's ontological argument. For Anselm, it is a logical fact that if there is a God, he must be greater than anything else that can be conceived. If we could conceive of something greater, then that would be God, not the first thing. Since we're able to state this, we know that God exists, at the very least, in our minds.
And that is as far as it goes. To jump from that to an actual existence is completely unjustified.
But if God only exists in our minds, then the idea existing in reality would be greater than our conception of God, but there can be nothing greater than God. Therefore, God must exist in reality.
Nope, that is a massive non sequitur. I'm not even sure how to respond to it because it's just not even a little bit logically justified.
In other words, the very idea of God necessitates God's existence.
I like the idea of God, therefore God exists. Thank you for affirming that my reductionist version of the argument was accurate.
For some, this might sound like a mind trick or some wishful thinking.
I mean, yeah, that is exactly what it is. There is no reason to think that reality is in any way determined by what human beings are capable of imagining, regardless of how great the thing that they are imagining is. But on top of that, there's also the problem of how we're measuring greatness for this argument. Greatness is a subjective measurement. The way I see it, a god that is the greatest thing ever is also a unicorn. So no version of God is greater than that. Does that mean that God is a unicorn? Well, someone else might think that a greater God is one who is a flying spaghetti monster. How do we determine which is actually the greater God? And really, a God that would be the greatest God of all is one who would provide amazing sexual pleasure on request. Since nothing sucks my dick when I pray for a blowjob, God doesn't exist.
Surely thinking about unicorns doesn't make them exist. But that's not what Anselm is getting at.
Isn't it though? Like, sure, the more sophisticated versions of the argument get into things like the property of necessity, but they all ultimately come down to what human beings can imagine. So if I can imagine a unicorn that definitionally has the property of necessity, one that actually exists would be greater than one that only exists in my imagination, therefore unicorns exist. And again, there's the subjective nature of how we're measuring greatness. The God of the Bible, as Christians describe him, is not the greatest God that I can imagine, since he rewards and punishes people based on their beliefs, not their actions, and he does nothing to protect those that he claims to love. I can imagine a God who is more fair and just than that, therefore, by the logic of this argument, God exists and is most definitely not the Christian God.
What this argument does is less convert atheists into theists, and more ground our understanding of God logically, helping us to understand the nature of God.
So then it's not an argument, it's a logical grounding. I mean, it's not really even that, but if it's not meant to convince someone of something, then it's just not an argument.
If God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, then God must be omnipotent, omnipresent, all-loving, and completely sufficient in himself.
And the fact that you are making a video explaining how God is completely sufficient in himself is itself a demonstration that God is not, in fact, completely sufficient in himself. If he were, we wouldn't need you to explain why to us, it would be self-evident.
God is not just some powerful wizard in the sky or some Santa Claus-like figure, for these things have limitations and potentialities.
No, I can imagine Santa Claus with no limitations or potentialities, who is greater than God because he rewards people based on their actions, not their beliefs. Ergo, Santa is God and must be real.
The point he is trying to make is that God is not like other creatures, finite, weak, filled with potential.
If the Christian God exists, then he has the potential to make me feel sexual pleasure anytime I ask him to. But he doesn't, so he has unfulfilled potential. I know I'm being crass, but the point remains no matter what you change the example to. If an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing being who is omnipresent exists, then there are many things that being could potentially do that would objectively make the world a better place, which that being does not do, meaning that being has quite a bit of potential that it is not living up to.
God is by his very nature perfect.
Perfect is again subjective and changes depending on the circumstances. A perfect sweater is not perfect on a hot day. A perfect keyboard will not have the same features from one person to the next. One person might prefer a split ergonomic keyboard, another might prefer the more classic layout. Some people prefer loud, clicky key switches, others prefer the quieter, soft membrane switches. Perfect headphones depend largely on one's subjective preferences. Are you an audiophile who needs perfect control of an EQ, or do you not care much about sound quality as long as they're comfortable? Do you need or want noise cancellation? Do you prefer earbuds, over-ear, on-ear, etc.? What is perfect is subjective and subject to change. And no, I didn't just list things that I could see lying around while I was scripting. I'd never be that lazy. Am I perfectly lazy? Maybe. So if God is perfect in every way, then that means that he must also be the perfect butt plug, or else he wouldn't be perfect.
And so, rather than prove God outright, this proof helps to guide Christian theology away from illogical conceptions of God.
Not very well, it doesn't.
To believe in, say, a God that didn't care about the world would be a self-defeating conception of God, and so cannot exist.
Which then brings the problem of evil right to the forefront. A God that cares about the world wouldn't let the world get to the state that it's in. But that's another topic for another day.
Of course, there are other logical ways of conceiving of God beyond deduction and abstract concepts. We can also look to human nature and propose what are called moral arguments.
Yeah, the arguments that exclusively give God credit for a few big-ticket moral items that most people can generally agree on, but dismisses all of the myriad of moral disagreements that people have as being the result of the fall. This is very much an argument based on cherry-picking.
When we look to human nature across time and space, there is quite a bit of diversity, yes, but strikingly, there is a lot of similarity as well.
And just as strikingly, the areas that are most similar are also the ones that would have the largest impact on evolution for a social species.
In every culture, cold-blooded killing is immoral.
And in a social species, if cold-blooded killing were considered acceptable, then that would have a detrimental impact on the survival of that species.
In every people, rape is an abomination.
Okay, you might want to take that one up with God, since in his supposedly morally perfect book, it amounts to no more than a property crime, where the perpetrator is punished by having to purchase the damaged goods from her father. And that's just the rule surrounding Hebrew women. For the women of a foreign city that the Israelites were invading, they were considered plunder. And if you found one of the women of the foreign city to be beautiful, you can force her into being your wife, and after giving her a whole month to mourn her dead parents that presumably died by your hand as you invaded her city, you are then allowed to rape her.
In every society, theft is outlawed.
Theft within an in-group, maybe, but not from those considered to be the out-group. Competing tribes, enemy cities, people of different religions. Hell, the book of Joshua records the Hebrews getting the land promised to them by God by way of stealing it from the people that were already living there. Now, sure, you justify that by saying it's not stealing when God promised it to them, but promising something that belongs to someone else isn't a great look, to say the least.
Is this because everyone's read their Bible and learned these moral truths? Highly unlikely.
Right. At best, it's a manifestation of our subjective preferences combined with empathy and a not insignificant dose of self-interest. We don't like the idea of those things happening to us, so we don't do it to others. And we live in a society where that is the norm, with people who act outside the norm being punished in one way or another. So even if we don't find empathy to be a sufficient reason to behave in accordance with the moral code, self-interest will still usually have us doing that.
Given the diversity of time and place, given the fact that some of these cultures existed before the commandments were even written or had no contact with the outside world, the fact that these truths are held universally shows that they were not taught, but rather exist innately in human nature.
Not really. I'm not even sure I'd agree with them being held universally. The Bible itself has plenty of examples of cold-blooded killing that are not just tolerated, but celebrated. Jephthah sacrificing of his daughter in exchange for God giving him victory in battle comes immediately to mind. Sure, maybe you could argue about that not really being in cold blood because Jephthah was distressed about having to kill his child, but that seems like splitting hairs over something that we would universally condemn if it happened today. Besides, there's also the genocides commanded by the God of the Bible. The Amalekite genocide, for instance, was where God commanded that the Israelites strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have, adding that they are not to spare them but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Now, for the Canaanite genocides where absolute language is used, it is often argued that the language is hyperbolic in nature. You can say that you totally destroyed someone without that being literally true, after all, and such hyperbole was common in ancient historical writing, so that's not without precedent. But in this case, we wind up with God stating that he regrets making Saul king because despite being very thorough about the Amalekite genocide, killing everyone except their king, the fact is that he didn't kill the king and kept some of the livestock alive. Not being thorough about killing every last living thing that belonged to the Amalekites is the act of rebellion that ultimately led God to replacing Saul with David. And that's just the cold-blooded killing thing that you mentioned. I could go through similar examples with every moral issue that you claimed is universal.
There's something within us that just knows these things are wrong. No one had to tell us.
If no one had to tell us, then why are the Ten Commandments even necessary? If everyone has these moral laws written on their heart and are in perfect agreement about them, then why is it necessary to legislate them?
And if that's the case, if there are moral truths that exist in nature universally, meaning that they were not written or prescribed by humans, then there must be an intelligent, moral being that fashioned the way the world is.
Or there's the unintelligent opportunistic process of natural selection, which explains how, while there may be some general principles that, if we only look at them superficially, seem to have been universally agreed upon, the vast majority of moral questions have different answers depending on who you ask. This actually perfectly explains what we see. Natural selection works by selecting the traits that work best in a given environment or situation, but part of it is that there are multiple variations of the trait that's being selected from which it can choose. And variation never really goes away. There might be one trait that wins out, but it will never be perfectly ubiquitous and static. And that's what we see when we look at how morality has developed over the past 10,000 years or so. There are some general principles that are mostly agreed upon, but they are not universal, and there is some variation in the details of those principles, both in when they are applicable and how they are enforced. That's not what we would expect from a universal moral law that is built into everyone without needing to be taught.
There must be a God who writes these truths on our hearts.
There are some general moral principles that see wide agreement among different cultures, therefore God. Thank you for affirming that my reductionist version of the argument was accurate.
Now, some will undoubtedly point out that there are some individuals in our world that disagree with these precepts, and even more that blatantly ignore them.
And before he can blame the fall or whatever for that fact, I'll just point out that such people are expected in the case of an evolutionary origin for morality. The so-called cheaters. When viewed from an evolutionary perspective, morality is basically about individuals meeting their own needs and advancing their own interests in cooperative ways. Which means that the existence of cheaters, individuals who act morally when others are watching but immorally when they believe they can get away with it, is all but inevitable.
This does not disprove the existence of natural law, but merely points to the disobedience and ignorance of some in humanity.
Not even gonna blame the fall then. Okay. Disobedience and ignorance. I could see the case for disobedience, but ignorance? You are literally using the ubiquity of certain moral principles as evidence for God. Principles that, as you said, don't need to be taught, but are innately known. The existence of people that could be said to be ignorant of these moral principles demonstrates that they are not, in fact, universal as you are claiming, and that they do, in fact, need to be taught.
Individuals will fall short of any moral code. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Doesn't it, though? Like, sure, in general I'd agree, but when you claim that the moral code is written onto everybody's hearts by an all-powerful being, and that the universal agreement on moral principles is evidence of that, then when that agreement fails to be universal, it demonstrates that that is not, in fact, the case.
When we see a near universal acceptance of certain truths across language and culture, there can only be one answer. God made it that way.
And why can that be the only answer? Especially given that it is only nearly universal. We are dealing with an all-powerful being here. Near universal might as well be non-existent. And I've already given a very brief overview of how evolution could have made it that way, and what's more, the evolutionary explanation perfectly accounts for the existence of disagreement on moral principles, even the ones that are nearly universal. I didn't need to hand-wave away a hole in my explanation with what amounts to, "Po buddy's nerfect."
And for what purpose? Why do we exist? To answer that question, we must conclude with our fourth and final proof, teleological arguments.
Ooh, I see some circularity coming. You see, in order to determine whether or not something was designed, it is incredibly helpful to know what that thing was designed for. So to look at something post hoc, then hunt for a purpose that looks like it might have been designed for, and then declare that it must have been designed because it fits that purpose, is entirely circular.
When you think about the complexity of our world, the nature of subatomic particles, the depth of the human brain, how delicate life is in this universe, and yet it thrives.
Does it thrive? The universe is a big place, and there's only one tiny little insignificant planet in the whole thing, that we are aware of at least, that has life. Now, sure, that doesn't mean that life doesn't exist somewhere else that we just haven't found, but given our current information, life seems like a somewhat rare occurrence in the universe. And even if we just look at the Earth, whether life is thriving very much depends on what life we're looking at. Ants? Sure, they are killing it. Polar bears? Not so much. For the most part, life seems to be just getting by as best it can with the limited resources it has access to. And really, if we're looking at this from a design standpoint, God designed a species that would overrun the planet and make it completely uninhabitable for a significant number of other species that he also made, driving many of them to extinction. You'd think he could have designed something with a bit more balance to it, but apparently not.
And then consider the astronomical number of factors that had to be in place for each to develop over a course of 14 billion years, it seems improbable, to say the least, that they happened by accident.
Who's saying they happened by accident? Do you know that anything even could have been different? Do you know to what degree a difference is possible? Do you know the extent to which life could survive in universes with different properties? Do you know the different kinds of life that could potentially develop in universes with properties that would make life as we know it impossible? Are you aware of the potential plausible reasons for why the universe appears fine-tuned, like the idea that it may be the result of the wave function of the universe itself, or that the appearance of fine-tuning is generated dynamically within a larger multiverse? These are just a handful of the questions that you'll need to answer before fine-tuning could get you even remotely close to God as the answer.
You're telling me that we exist simply by chance?
Chance as governed by the laws of physics, yes.
Those are some long odds.
Those are some long odds, which you don't appear to have bothered to calculate. It just seems intuitively unlikely to you, and that's good enough for you, I guess. But I'm gonna need more than your intuition when it comes to making important decisions about my life, like what religion I should be.
The universe is more than a random collection of atoms. It has order, intelligibility, beauty, and even purpose.
A lot of those qualities are subjective ones that we are imposing upon various aspects of nature. Beauty, for instance, is not an intrinsic quality of anything. It is so famously subjective that everyone knows the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And if the existence of things that we find aesthetically pleasing is proof of God, then what of the myriad of things that are most definitely not aesthetically pleasing? Is my weird misshapen penis proof that God doesn't exist because it is so objectively ugly? Order is merely a result of the laws of physics. Intelligibility is the logical extension of this so-called order. It's all fluff with no substance.
There is no way that all of this is the result of mere randomness. Christians conclude that there must be a source of the intelligence, a being that is all-knowing and all-powerful. God.
Why, though? Like, even if I grant that everything was actually designed intentionally by something, why does that something have to be all-knowing and all-powerful? Why could there not be limits? Hell, being limited would actually explain a lot about the universe. That's why he had to design us through the hellscape of a process that is evolution. He couldn't just make us as is. That's why for every aesthetically pleasing thing you can think of, there's another that is distasteful at the very least. But then this brings us back to the beginning of this argument where he talked about the purpose of life. It seems, by looking at evolution in particular, that there wasn't an end goal in mind, it just did what it could with what it had access to. So yeah, that looks pretty random. But he's starting with the conclusion that there is a design to be found, and then working his way backward to find the purpose for the thing that exists that he knows must be designed. And since he decided in advance that the thing that did the designing had to be all-knowing and all-powerful, because the ultimate goal is to get to the Christian God as the designer, then he imposes those requirements onto the evidence without justification. Sure, the design looks like shit, but the designer had to be all-knowing and all-powerful in order to design it, for reasons. It just doesn't track.
The most famous of these arguments is the watchmaker. When you look to the many gears and components that make up a watch, there is no way that the universe could have randomly produced it. It requires that there be an intelligent creator.
There are plenty of things that we know happen, not so much randomly, but guided by the laws of physics, which are incredibly intricate and complex, comparable to a watch. But we don't assume that those things are designed. And the main reason for this is previous experience. We know that watches are designed because we've only ever seen them come about through the process of design. Other intricate and complex things, like Ewingite, which I'm sure is actually pronounced more like Ewingite, but Ewingite makes it sound like a type of rebel fighter ship in Star Wars, so I'm sticking with that. It is the most complex mineral structure on Earth that we know of, far more intricate and complex than plenty of man-made objects. And yet we don't look at it and say, holy shit, God must have put this one together. No. We explain how it forms as a result of a specific type of uranium oxidation that occurs in a very narrow pH range with enough humidity, working as dictated by the laws of physics.
But there are more sophisticated versions of this argument as well. When we look to the natural world and see even inanimate, unintelligent things acting with some intelligible pattern or towards a particular end, it follows that there must be an intelligent end by which everything was created and toward which everything is oriented.
Yeah, but unless you know in advance what that end is, then at best, you're engaging in ad hoc speculation here.
Beyond just an argument of design, like the watchmaker, this sort of argument implies more than just intelligibility, but purpose. The things we see do not simply reveal some order in the universe, they bear witness to why they exist in the first place.
And again, unless you know that purpose in advance, it cannot be anything more firm than speculation. If, for example, you were completely unaware of the existence of nails or hammers, and you were presented with a hammer for the first time ever, and then asked to determine its purpose, there are any number of non-nail related things that it could be used for to varying degrees of success. But without actually knowing that purpose in advance, you don't really have a way of figuring out which purpose was the intended one. Clearly, its main intended purpose is to open piggy banks. It works perfectly for that, after all.
In this way, the entire universe can be explained by a single, intelligent, purposeful being that calls all things into existence and draws all things to himself. That can only be God.
Well, yeah, obviously if you invent a purpose for things without justification, you can also then invent a being that had that purpose in mind. That doesn't make him real, though.
At least, that's what Christians say.
That is what Christians say, but are you not even going to give a single example of a thing with a clear purpose and what that purpose is? Or was that vague nonsense about everything being drawn towards the purpose-giving being supposed to be an all-encompassing purpose? Didn't you say that this was the more sophisticated version? This doesn't even rise to the level of my reductionist version of the argument, which, to remind you, was life exists where it's possible for life to exist, therefore God. This is just, I feel like things are being drawn to a specific thing that I like the idea of, therefore God.
You might not be convinced.
Correct. I am indeed not convinced. I found this whole thing to be rather underwhelming, to be honest. Usually Catholics are better at cloaking their fallacious logic in difficult to understand technical philosophical jargon, but Father Casey has successfully cut through all that and made it easy to see why the logic doesn't actually work for any of those arguments. So, well done?
Which is why, ultimately, in discussions like this, it's important to make two things abundantly clear. The world is filled with evidence for the existence of God, and our minds are capable of logically understanding it, and even the most rational of arguments will not convert some people who have not received the gift of faith.
To restate that, the evidence and arguments that point to the Christian God don't actually work unless you already believe in the Christian God. Start from the conclusion and rationalize your way backward.
While it is true that the First Vatican Council taught that God can be known with certainty by the natural light of human reason, the Church has never posited that reason alone is enough to know God.
Doesn't the first thing there, at the very least, heavily imply that you can know God through reason alone, though? Like, what else could it even mean? God can be known with certainty by the natural light of human reason. How can that possibly work in a world where reason alone is not enough to know God? Do you not hear how those two statements are direct contradictions? Well, I'm not sure what I expected. If believing contradictory things were a problem for you, you wouldn't believe the Bible. So, sure, I guess those two very obviously mutually exclusive statements somehow don't conflict.
Thus, there will be many who will look to these arguments without the light of faith and be unconvinced.
Hi, yeah, that's me. I'm right here. It's me. I'm the problem, it's me. I don't actually know that song.
Instead, what they offer us as Christians is not a weapon to use against our enemies, but immensely helpful tools to give reason and logic to what we already know and see in the world.
I mean, I guess credit to him for admitting that his video isn't meant to convince non-believers, but is just meant to give comfort to people who already agree with his conclusions. That is basically the goal of all apologetics, but usually they like to pretend that it's supposed to be outreach to non-believers rather than the circle jerk that it actually is. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Scientia Historia, who says, "Best Rhino Powell episode ever. Pregnant rocks. First microorganism having nothing to mate with. A cynic might think Rhino and Powell have a drinking session together where they make all this up." Honestly, I can see why you would think that. I can't give you anything more than my word that that's not what's happening, but I could totally see a couple of atheist YouTubers getting drunk together and then deciding to see how ridiculous they can make creationist arguments before the other creationists will jump ship. If you had told me when I first started my channel that I would, in the future, find myself defending the idea that physical piles of stuff are a category of things that are possible, I would have laughed in incredulity. Yet here we are. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Don't forget to go to
apply.vicerhino.com
if you want a shot at becoming my official channel editor. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Adam Schaefer, who apparently went more nuts than me and decided to pledge at the maximum tier, and all the rest, who are the logical fallacies that are the only way to prove that the God that is my channel exists. If you'd like to actually accomplish the exact opposite of your stated intentions, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/vicerhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! They at least won't be willing to adopt a label that they associate with such idiocy. They at least won't be willing to adopt a label that they a label. Why do I keep saying label? A label, label, a label, 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 label. Labia. It's on the brain. Regardless of how great the thing they imagine are, our imagining is, fuck.